Hi, I'm Hull History Nerd, and welcome to another episode of the History of Hull Bridges. And this time we're going to be taking a look at a bridge that only recently passed from being a bridge that existed to nothing but a memory. Scott Street Bridge. You know, it's kind of weird standing here where the bridge used to be, because it's become such a local landmark with the two halves of its drawbridge standing up, permanently open since the 90s. And now there's just this big empty space. The skyline looks all wrong down here. And of course, during Hull City of Culture celebrations, it gained its own Banksy as well on this side, the West Bank, the Draw the Raised Bridge, which of course now has been taken off and stored, I think, for display in a gallery, although I'm not entirely sure at the moment. But the bridge itself has become nothing but a ghost. I never thought when I began making the History of Hull series that I'd be looking at something that actually turned into just history during the process of filming. But luckily, I actually came out and got a lot of footage of Scott Street Bridge while it was still here. So I'm not actually just going to be standing here and showing you the ruins and the marks where it used to be.
Scott Street Bridge was built in the 1900s to connect the two halves of the busy industrial heart of the city between Schullcoates Bridge on Chapman Street and North Bridge, in order to shorten lengthy walks for many workers and wagons in the area. An idea that had been much discussed for the last 2 decades. Designed as a traditional 2-leaf bascule bridge with the counterweight slung underneath the road deck, it was an early example of a lifting bridge in Hull. Up to this point, most of Hull's existing bridges were swing bridges, with the notable exception of the ageing Old North Bridge. But possibly the most interesting part about Scott Street's engineering was its power source.
So the plan was for the bridge to be powered by Hull's first municipal power network, the Hull Hydraulic Power Company, which had been founded about 20 years earlier. And its main pumping station and accumulator tower was actually just round the corner across the road down Matchell Street. The building for the hydraulic pumping station actually still exists today, and although the huge high water tower is gone, you can still see the iron around the top of the building where it used to be. Now, this is an interesting thing to talk about, Hull's Hydraulic Power Company, because it's actually really important. It was one of the first municipal power networks in the whole country. That's right, we got a power network before Manchester, before Liverpool, before London. And this was effectively a test bed, an experimental test bed for the ideas of a man called Edward Ellington of the Hydraulic Engineering Company, who actually engineered and built the system. You see, in 1869, Ellington had this grand idea of a network of hydraulic pipes underneath every major industrial city, providing cheap power to any company that wanted it or needed it, and perhaps wanted to avoid the cost of installing their own steam engines or their own hydraulic power service. But his superiors were not convinced. They didn't know whether it was going to actually take off, whether anybody would be interested, whether they'd get any paying customers, and even before they got to that point of asking, they would need to dig up a lot of roads to lay a lot of pipes and build a lot of pumping stations, and that's a huge expense. So Ellington started looking for a place where he could do a trial run, somewhere inexpensive, where all the industry was in a relatively small area and right next to a source of water, ideally, so that the pipes from the pumping station and to the businesses wouldn't need to necessarily be very long. And he found that place here in Hull.
Ellington's eyes turned to the relatively small and tightly focused city of Hull. Most of the businesses in the city clustered around the river and were compacted into a fairly small area, a factor that made laying the network's pipes relatively cheap compared to the more sprawling cities like Manchester or Liverpool. There were also some pretty much guaranteed customers in Hull's town docks, which were falling technologically behind their newer siblings such as Albert Dock, which had its own hydraulic power system. Consent was gained from the corporation, and by 1876 the Hull Hydraulic Power Company began operations. There were two main accumulator towers, the main one here at Matchell Street and another on Grimsby Lane closer to the Humber. And by 1895, just before the planning of Scott Street Bridge, the company was providing power to well over 50 clients. The idea had been proven to be so successful that Ellington had a hand in spreading similar hydraulic projects throughout not just the UK, but other parts of the world. It was the obvious choice to power the new Scott Street Bridge, and plans were drawn up, including a high-pressure water conduit that would run under the river to power the bridge mechanism on the east bank. The conduit still exists to this day, although now it houses other utility cables and pipes. After the extensive city remodelling by Hermann Goering in the early 1940s, however, Hull's pioneering hydraulic power system was damaged beyond repair, and had already been superseded by electrical power provided by the corporation's own power station on Skulcoats Lane. The damage was never repaired, and the hydraulic system was allowed to fade into obscurity.
So Scott Street Bridge was opened in 1902, and in common with some of the other bridges that were opened around the turn of the century or just before, it has a few design flaws. The bridges like Chapman Street and the old Drypool Bridge were all really narrow and often very lightly constructed. And Scott Street Bridge in particular had a twisting, weird entranceway, which was fine if you were going over it in a horse and cart. Not so easy to navigate if you're trying to get an 18-wheel articulated lorry over it. You see, they'd been designed at a time when there was no idea just how hectic the traffic was going to get in the 20th century, or how heavy the vehicles were going to be. And whilst the bridge was renovated in the 1940s and again in the 1960s to try and make it a bit more robust, you only have to look at the difference in design between Scott Street Bridge and its younger sibling North Bridge to see what difference 30 years can make in the anticipation of engineering difficulties. North Bridge is broad, it's heavily built, its mechanisms are robust, and its entranceways are long, low and clear and straight. It was designed for 20th century traffic, and it's still suitable even now for 21st century traffic. Whereas Scott Street Bridge, well, that was struggling with 20th century traffic even as early as the 1950s. And despite all the work that was done to it, in 1994 it was retired. It was closed permanently, the two halves of its drawbridges raised and secured in place with cables. The estimated cost of repairing it came to about £5 million, so it was left. It got listed about the same time, but sadly the state of the bridge deteriorated over the last 25 years to the point where now it's had to be removed, leaving nothing but a ghost of its former presence. Over there, you can see the footings of the bridge, and of course, the blue distinctive railings that lead up to it, which is a thing that I remember from my childhood when my granddad used to come this way in the car. I always knew we were in for the slightly car-sick inducing twisty turns and hill of this entrance ramp. This is a bit of a first for Hull History Nerd, really. It's the first time I've ever covered something that's disappeared whilst I've been making my videos.